go forward to the slides. Go forward to, click forward to, Hemant.
Regulators in mature markets, for instance in Europe or North America, tend to put a lot of pressure on revenues, for instance by forcing telcos to reduce roaming charges. What's the part of roaming in their revenue, and do you see such a threat in the largest markets?
I would, sorry. In terms of roaming sort of outside of your native country, I mean, for MTN, that's quite a benefit to have due to their large footprint across sort of Africa. In terms of international roaming, that would probably form, I think it does actually form quite a small portion of their total revenue, and so probably the effect would be minimal.
Just to add to that, the majority of the cost incurred when MTN subscribers are actually overseas, say for example in Europe, is actually transferred straight onto the customer. So the customer bears the brunt of that cost increase. MTN doesn't actually see a lot of that cost increase fall upon on their operating costs.
I have a question on your DCF valuation. I've seen that you apply this 6.8% terminal growth on Nigeria, for instance, which has a 70% penetration rate. So I was wondering to which year you applied that. So how many years did you estimate in your DCF before applying that rate? And don't you think it may be too high for a market which already has a 70% penetration? And why is not such a market close to being mature? So where's the upside, basically?
I think sort of in terms of, we used a 5-year sort of forecast period before we hit our terminal growth rate. And throughout those 5 years, we used numerous sources of information to synthesize those growth rates. And that was IMF data, sort of intelligence network data on penetration and growth within the country, inflation within the country. So that is sort of, we were primarily sort of based our revenue growth on. In perpetuity, I think it's important to note that in South Africa, which is a mature market, market penetration is closer to 150%. And so 70% in Nigeria still means sort of a long period of growth before you actually reach utter maturity. And Nigeria is substantially behind where South Africa was sort of in its early stages.
Just following up on this, you have used 4.8 perpetual growth rate for South Africa. I mean, what was the real growth rate in South Africa, the GDP growth rate, for example, in 2013?
Real growth is usually closer to between 2 or 3%. We've seen South Africa come quite badly out of the recession in terms of that. However, MTN's revenue, as well as tailwinds from Forex, has seen its performance substantially higher than that. And that's not just because of growth outside of the country. We've also seen subscriber numbers really increase. So although already we have quite a well-penetrated market, the growth is actually very reasonable given the historical performance of the last 5 years.
Yeah, but I'm asking about the South African operation or the South African operator. You have used a 4.8% perpetual growth rate, which is higher than the GDP or higher even than the average GDP growth rate in the past few years, right? And we're talking about a mature, highly penetrated, probably fiercely competitive market. Don't you think the rate is a bit too high to value the South African operation, that is?
No, we don't think it's too high. I think there's two things that are coming out of that. First of all, the fact that mobile telecoms have actually almost outperformed GDP in a sense, in that the rates, the revenue, the earnings have been substantially higher than other operating segments or other industries, and therefore higher than the GDP. Furthermore, although South Africa is a mature African market, what we find is that there's actually still some room for growth, and that room for growth is really coming in terms of data. So in internet penetration, Africa as a whole is actually far below the world average, and that improved network quality as well as further subscribers, more smartphones, that will actually push growth to what we feel was that 4.8% terminal growth rate.
And sorry, just to add one more thing quickly, is that terminal growth rate model we showed included inflation forecasts, and 2 to 3% is normally South Africa's real growth per year. So included in that terminal growth rate is an inflation figure, which in South Africa is between 5.8 and 6% at the moment, and it's forecasted to be in that area for quite some time.
You mentioned data penetration, and I was wondering, what is the percentage of ARPU that is currently coming from data, excluding SMS, of course, please, in the main countries that MTN is operating in? And sorry, if I may add a second question. Do you see an opportunity, or maybe it's already an existing trend, for mobile data to substitute for fixed line, which I suspect is not particularly, popular? And
just to address the first part of your question there, currently mobile data sort of has been growing as a percentage of revenue. At the moment, it's between 15 and 17% of group revenue. But more importantly, in the large, high growth operating countries such as Nigeria, we've seen a huge amount of growth in the data as a percentage of total revenue. So, for example, in Nigeria in 2012, data formed about 12.5% of revenue, and now that is up from now in 2013 closer to 16 or 17%, which is a lot for a year. As Lauren mentioned earlier, also that's also seen as a big potential driver for South African growth. And what management have been saying, and their forecasts are that as soon as 2017, 2018, data revenue on its own could form up to 25% of the entire group's revenue. I think just to address the second part of the question, Africa is very, very unique in that mobile penetration is sort of at an average of 67%, but internet penetration is very, very low. And what we see in Africa is there's a unique situation where mobile penetration is actually driving internet penetration. So the more phones there are, the more internet there is. So when they say that they want every village to have internet, they mean they want every village to have a phone. Because with a phone, then you have internet in that village. And that's, as you said, the plan is that the mobile data will replace the need for fixed lines in, for example, rural Africa.
In your DCF analysis, you show that I think about a third of the value of the company comes outside of Nigeria and South Africa. Please discuss the sensitivity of the share price to these regions and operating areas.
Just to tackle your question from a high level, because it's sort of a very diversified region, the sensitivity to the whole region is sort of an unlikely situation that it's all going to bomb out. So in terms of one country sort of bombing out completely actually has a really small impact on the intrinsic value of our valuation. So we can say I think it's about 16 countries contribute a third of the ascribed value. So sort of to any one of those countries, you'd find that there's very limited sensitivity regardless of what happens in the country.
And who are the competitors in Nigeria?
Yes, so in Nigeria, what we see is that it's really Glocel and Bharti Airtel. These are probably the biggest competitors. Mon, would you like to put up that slide for me? You can see more clearly over here that MTN actually does lead the way, though, and that's mostly driven by the fact that they have the most connections. So they actually are leading the way in terms of subscribers, and as we told you before, subscribers and ARPU are main drivers of revenue. So that's why MTN is very well positioned to take advantage of the Nigerian market.
Nigeria also offers a bit of a success story for MTN, especially in 2013, the reported figures now. Subscriber growth was at 9.3 million users. And that actually outperformed all of their competitors, and they actually were able to grow their market share to just over 50% of the markets. And that is within an already very competitive market, and in a competitive market where rates have been cut. And I think the strength that MTN has in that market over its competitors is that it can deal with the fact that Nigerian regulators require a certain amount of network quality.